It all started on a bright Saturday morning in a quiet, upper-middle-class suburb. The kind of town where everyone knows everyone, and strangers stick out. The local cafe, known for its strong coffee and cozy vibes, was slowly filling up with the usual weekend crowd. Families grabbing breakfast, students tapping on laptops, and retirees chatting over muffins. At around 9:10 a.m., the door chimed, and in walked Marcus Williams, a tall, well-groomed black man in his early 40s. He wore a dark hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. Casual, comfortable, nothing flashy. But he walked with a quiet confidence, the kind you don't always notice until you have to. Marcus had served 15 years with the FBI, specializing in cybercrime and organized fraud. But that day, he wasn't working. He was just there to meet an old college friend for coffee and conversation. He smiled politely at the barista, ordered a black coffee and a cinnamon roll, paid, and took a seat by the window. He pulled out a paperback book and started reading as soft jazz played in the background. A few tables away, a middle-aged white man noticed him. This man didn't know Marcus, but instead of minding his own business, he kept glancing over. Maybe it was the hoodie. Maybe it was the color of Marcus's skin. Maybe it was just the combination. But what happened next shocked everyone. At 9:17 a.m., a local police officer walked in. He wasn't responding to a call, just grabbing his usual donut and coffee. The man who had been staring earlier got up, walked over to the cop, and whispered something into his ear while pointing at Marcus. Within seconds, the officer approached Marcus's table. "Excuse me," the officer said sharply. "I'm going to need you to leave." Marcus looked up slowly, confused. "I'm sorry. I said you need to leave. Right now." "What?" Marcus asked, still calm, but clearly surprised. "You're making some customers uncomfortable," the officer replied. "You're loitering. You need to go." "I'm not loitering," Marcus said. "I bought coffee. I'm sitting here waiting for someone." The officer's tone hardened. "Don't argue. Get up and walk out before this becomes a bigger issue." The cafe suddenly went silent. Forks stopped clinking. Conversations paused. People began turning their heads. One woman whispered, "What's going on?" Another muttered, "Why is he being asked to leave? He didn't do anything." Meanwhile, Marcus kept his cool. He reached into his pocket, not aggressively, but carefully, and pulled out his receipt. He held it up. "I paid for my coffee. Here's the proof." But the officer wouldn't even look at it. "I'm not going to argue with you," he said. "Stand up, or I'll escort you out myself." The young barista behind the counter, clearly nervous, spoke up. "He's fine, officer. He didn't do anything wrong. He's just reading." But the officer ignored her. Marcus slowly closed his book and looked the officer in the eye. "Are you sure you want to keep pushing this?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The officer didn't flinch. "You have 5 seconds." That was it. The moment. A line had been crossed. Not because Marcus had done anything wrong, but because a man in power had decided he didn't belong. No crime. No complaint. Just the color of his skin and an assumption of guilt. Everyone was watching. Phones came out. Cameras started recording. And what happened next would turn this simple cafe into the center of a national conversation. The cafe had turned into a pressure cooker. Tension was thick. Some customers clutched their cups tighter. Others froze mid-sip. All eyes were now locked on one table and one man. Marcus Williams, still seated, still calm, looked directly at the officer. "Why are you bothering me?" he asked again, his tone steady but unwavering. The officer, likely in his mid-40s, with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses still perched on his head, stood tall like he was trying to assert dominance. "You're loitering," he repeated. "I received a complaint. You're making someone feel unsafe." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "So reading a book while waiting for a friend is now a threat." The officer shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't expecting pushback, especially not like this. Maybe he thought Marcus would get flustered, panic, argue, or just leave. But Marcus didn't, because he knew the game. He had spent years training agents, working in high-pressure interrogations, and de-escalating real threats. And this wasn't law enforcement. This was profiling, plain and simple. "I've done nothing wrong," Marcus continued. "You have no legal reason to ask me to leave. You haven't identified a crime. You haven't provided evidence. You're targeting me because I look different. A soft gasp escaped from one of the customers. People were whispering now, but their phones were still pointed forward, recording every second. The cafe's manager, a petite woman in her 30s, emerged from behind the counter and tried to intervene. "Officer," she said politely, "he's not bothering anyone. He came in, bought coffee, and has been sitting quietly. There's no issue." But the officer ignored her. He locked eyes with Marcus. "I don't care what the receipt says. I have the right to ask you to leave." Marcus leaned forward slightly, hands still on the table, voice low and even. "That's not how the law works. You can't just remove someone from a business they paid to be in without cause. That's an abuse of power." Now the officer's face turned red. Whether from embarrassment, anger, or both, it was clear he wasn't in control anymore. He grabbed his radio, possibly to call for backup. "You're escalating this," he muttered. "No, you are," Marcus replied calmly. "This could have ended the moment you asked what I was doing, and I told you." The manager, now more confident, stepped in again. "He's welcome here, officer. We don't want trouble, but we also don't want anyone removed without cause." Several customers nodded in agreement. One older man even spoke out. "You're out of line, officer." The officer looked around, realizing the room was no longer on his side. That's when Marcus took a breath. A long one. He'd stayed patient long enough. He had given the officer multiple chances to walk away, to back down, to correct his behavior. But now it was time to put the issue to rest once and for all. He reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket. The officer immediately flinched. "Hands where I can see them." Marcus paused, looked around, then, with deliberate care, pulled out a slim black leather wallet. He opened it and turned it toward the officer. The gold flashed. The seal said it all. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The officer's face drained of color. The chatter in the cafe stopped. Everyone leaned in. Cameras zoomed. Marcus held up the badge and said with deliberate weight, "Special Agent Marcus Williams, FBI, and you've just made a very serious mistake." Time seemed to stop. As Marcus slowly opened the leather case, the unmistakable gold of the FBI badge glinted under the warm cafe lights. He held it steady in front of the officer, the full credentials clearly visible. Special Agent Marcus D. Williams, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The officer's eyes widened. His rigid posture slackened. His mouth opened, but for several long seconds, no words came out. The hand resting near his holster dropped to his side. The room fell completely silent. No coffee brewing sounds. No silverware clinking. Just the tension of reality crashing down on someone who had just tried to throw a federal agent out of a coffee shop, based purely on prejudice. Marcus didn't move, didn't blink. He let the moment sink in. He had seen this expression before, in interrogations, in courtrooms, in stings where criminals were caught red-handed. But this wasn't a criminal. This was a uniformed officer who had let his bias override both judgment and law. The officer stammered, I didn't know who you were." Marcus's response was calm, but razor sharp. "That's exactly the problem." He slowly stood up, not in anger, but with controlled authority. The kind that doesn't need volume to command respect. His voice remained calm, even as it cut through the air like a scalpel. "You didn't ask for ID. You didn't ask what I was doing. You didn't follow any proper procedure. You saw a black man sitting alone, and you assumed the worst." The officer shifted uncomfortably. "Look, maybe there's been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Marcus interrupted, tilting his head slightly. "You were about to put your hands on me. You threatened to remove me without cause. You tried to publicly humiliate someone who had done nothing wrong." A woman at the corner table could be heard whispering, "This is insane." Another person softly said, "He handled that way better than I would have." Marcus turned slightly to address the room, not just the officer. "This is what people of color face every day. Judged before we speak. Confronted without cause. Assumed guilty until proven innocent. Today, I had the privilege of a badge to protect me. But what if I didn't?" That question hung in the air. The officer looked around and realized he wasn't just wrong. He was being watched, recorded, and held accountable in real time. He fumbled for words again. "If I had known." Marcus stepped closer, calm but firm. "But you didn't know. because you didn't care to find out. You jumped to conclusions. That's not how the law works, officer. And it's not how people should be treated, ever. The cafe manager, now emboldened, stepped forward again. Sir, with all due respect, I think you owe this man an apology. He's been nothing but respectful. The officer gave a weak nod, eyes still darting nervously. I apologize, he muttered, barely audible. Marcus looked him in the eye. Next time, treat every person like they might carry a badge, or simply like they're human. The officer turned and left without another word, his footsteps heavy and fast. As the door closed behind him, a low wave of clapping rippled through the cafe. Not loud or mocking, but respectful, appreciative. People recognized that they had just witnessed something powerful, a quiet stand for justice, done without anger, but with integrity. One young man stood up and shook Marcus's hand. You showed more restraint than most of us ever could. Thank you. Marcus gave a simple nod. I didn't do anything special. I just did what was right. And with that, he sat back down, took a sip of now-cold coffee, and waited for his friend to arrive, like nothing had happened. But everyone in that cafe knew something important had. The moment the officer stepped out of the cafe and the door shut behind him, it was as if a storm had passed. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. Everyone had witnessed something deeply unsettling, yet incredibly powerful. Phones were still recording. The cameras didn't drop immediately. People looked around at one another, some shaking their heads, others with wide eyes, still trying to process what had just unfolded. A woman in her early 30s, sitting near the back with her toddler, spoke up first. That could have gone so differently, she said softly, but loud enough to be heard. If he wasn't FBI, what would have happened? Another customer, a college-aged man holding his phone, added, honestly, he probably would have been in cuffs. Or worse. Those words struck the entire room. The reality was clear. If Marcus hadn't had that badge, hadn't had the power of a federal title behind him, the situation could have escalated dangerously. That realization sent chills through more than one person present. The barista behind the counter looked visibly shaken. I was trying to step in, she told Marcus as she approached him, but I didn't know what to do. I've never seen anything like that. Marcus offered a small, understanding smile. You did the right thing. Speaking up matters. A man with salt and pepper hair, possibly in his 60s, approached next. Son, he said, I've lived in this town for 40 years, and I'm ashamed that this happened here. You handled yourself with class. Marcus nodded. He appreciated the support, but he didn't need the validation. What he wanted was for people to really see what had just occurred. Not just a misunderstanding. Not just a one-off, but a moment that peeled back the surface and showed what lies beneath far too often in American life. Assumption, prejudice, and unchecked authority. And thanks to the phone's recording, the story wasn't going to stay in that cafe. Within hours, clips of the confrontation began appearing on social media platforms. TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. The footage spread like wildfire. The caption on one of the most shared videos read, Cop tries to kick out black man at cafe. Regrets everything when he flashes his FBI badge. The comments were flooded with outrage, support, and tough conversations. Imagine if this man wasn't FBI. That cop wouldn't have backed down. This is exactly why people say systemic bias exists. The calmness he showed, the restraint, that was next level. Some people praised Marcus for his professionalism. Others condemned the officer's behavior and demanded accountability. Activists, civil rights groups, and public figures began reposting the clip. Back at the cafe, the energy was starting to shift. Customers who had remained quiet during the confrontation began to engage more directly with Marcus. One woman asked, "Do you think that officer will get in trouble?" Marcus, now finishing his long cold coffee, replied, "That's not up to me, but I'll make sure the department knows what happened." He wasn't angry, but he was resolute. This wasn't going to end in silence. Not for the officer, not for the department, and certainly not for the larger conversation this moment had sparked. As Marcus stood up to leave, a small group of people applauded quietly again. Not because he had embarrassed someone, but because he had shown strength without aggression. dignity without submission. And because he had made them all rethink how easily power can be misused and how quickly things can spiral based on perception alone. Outside, the sun was still shining. The day had returned to normal. But for those inside that cafe, and soon, for millions more online, nothing about that morning would ever feel ordinary again. Marcus Williams walked out of the cafe with the same calm energy he walked in with. No raised voice, no confrontation, just clarity and a powerful reminder of how dangerous assumptions can be. But while his steps were steady, his thoughts weren't still. He wasn't thinking about going viral or how many views a clip might get online. He was thinking about how close that morning came to becoming a headline with a much darker ending. He thought about the thousands of people who look like him, speak like him, dress like him, and don't carry an FBI badge to protect them. Later that evening, Marcus sat down at his desk and wrote a formal report about the incident. Not out of spite, not to ruin the officer's career, but because accountability matters, and more importantly, so does education. I didn't want revenge, Marcus would later explain in a local news interview. I wanted the department to know what happened. But more than that, I wanted to be part of the solution. He contacted the local police department and requested an internal review. But he went a step further. He offered to lead a voluntary workshop for officers on bias, de-escalation, and racial profiling. At first, the department was hesitant. But with the public now watching and community leaders speaking out, they agreed. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in front of a room full of officers. Some skeptical, some embarrassed, some genuinely willing to learn. He didn't lecture. He didn't shame. He shared. He told them what it felt like to be on the receiving end of fear. Not because of something you did, but simply because of who you are. He talked about what happens when power isn't checked. About the mental toll of constantly being second-guessed, questioned, or profiled for nothing more than your skin tone. And then he asked one powerful question. What would you have done if I weren't FBI? The room was silent. Some officers avoided his gaze. Others nodded, visibly uncomfortable. But that discomfort was necessary, because change never comes from comfort. Over time, the town's department introduced new training protocols. Bias awareness workshops became mandatory. The officer involved was formally reprimanded and removed from field duty temporarily while undergoing additional education and community service work. But most importantly, people started talking. Locals who had seen the video began asking deeper questions about how many incidents like this happen every day, but go unseen, undocumented, and unresolved. People who never believed racial profiling was real were now witnessing it firsthand. The cafe, once just a quiet spot for coffee and croissants, had become a symbol, not of outrage, but of awakening. The manager put up a small plaque near the door that read, "Respect, dignity, equality. Everyone is welcome here." Marcus returned weeks later, quietly. No cameras, no crowd. Just a coffee and a thank you to the barista who had spoken up. "You didn't have to say anything that day," he told her. She smiled, but it felt wrong to stay silent. And that, Marcus said, is how change begins. Not with grand speeches or viral videos, but with everyday people choosing to do the right thing in ordinary moments. Final message for every viewer watching this. This wasn't just about a racist cop. It wasn't just about a black man in a cafe. It wasn't even just about an FBI badge. It was about a system, a mindset, a reality that far too many face every day. But it was also about how one moment can spark awareness, how calm can overcome chaos, and how truth, when spoken with courage, can cut through even the deepest ignorance. Marcus didn't yell. He didn't escalate. He simply stood firm in his identity, knowing who he was, and refused to let someone else define him. If he had reacted with anger, the story might have ended differently. If there hadn't been witnesses, it might never have been believed. But instead, the world got to see exactly what millions experience and what dignity under pressure really looks like. So, if you've watched this far, here's what we want you to take away. White heavy checkmark, don't judge people by what you see on the surface. White heavy checkmark, speak up when something feels wrong. even if it's uncomfortable. White heavy check mark and know your rights. Whether you carry a badge or not, you matter.